October 1347, the harbour of Messina, Sicily. The fishermen saw them first at dawn, through the haze rolling off the strait. A small fleet of Genoese trading galleys coming in from the east. Nothing unusual in that. Messina was one of the great crossroads of the medieval world, a place where the spices of Asia, the silks of the Levant, and the gold of Africa all changed hands. Ships came and went with the tides, but these ships were wrong. They were moving too slowly, drifting, not steering. No one called out from the decks. No sailors scrambled to lower the sails or throw the lines ashore. The oars, the great banks of oars that should have been pulling in rhythm, hung motionless in the water, dragging like the legs of a dead insect. When the harbour men finally rowed out to meet them, they climbed aboard into a silence that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The crews were dead, almost all of them, and the few men still breathing were not really alive anymore. They lay in their own filth, burning with fever, their eyes glassy and unseeing. Under their arms, and in the hollows of their groins, were black swellings the size of eggs, some the size of apples. Their skin was mottled with dark blotches, as if bruised from the inside. They were bleeding beneath the surface. They stank of rot while their hearts were still beating. One chronicler, a Franciscan friar named Michel da Piazza, wrote it down. His words survive across nearly 7 centuries. They carried such a disease in their bodies that anyone who spoke to them was infected and could not escape death. The people of Messina did what any of us would have done. They ordered the ships out. Get them away from the harbour, burn them, drive them off, send them back to the sea. But it was already too late, because the thing that came off those ships was not something you could see. It was not the dying sailors. It was riding in the ropes, in the grain sacks, in the shadows below decks, and it was already stepping onto the stone quays of Sicily. Within days, the people of Messina began to die. Within 4 years, that thing would kill somewhere between 75 and 200 million human beings. It would empty entire villages. It would collapse the economy of a continent. It would shatter the faith of millions, spark massacres, and rewrite the future of the human race. They called it many things. The Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Great Dying. We call it the Black Death, and this is the story of how it began, and how in less than 5 years, it changed the world forever. To understand the horror of what happened, you first have to understand the world it happened to. The year is 1346. Europe is crowded. After 3 centuries of population growth, the continent is fuller than it has ever been. There are perhaps 80 million people living from the Atlantic coast to the steppes of Russia. Cities like Paris, Florence, and Venice pulse with commerce. Cathedrals scrape the sky, and binding it all together is trade, a vast humming web of ships and caravans that stretches all the way to China. This connectivity was Europe's greatest strength. It was about to become its executioner. But here is the first thing most people get wrong. The Black Death did not begin in Europe. It came from the East, and its true origins lie thousands of miles away in the dry steppes of Central Asia. Somewhere in these grasslands lived a small, unremarkable creature, the marmot, a fat, burrowing rodent. And in the blood of these animals lived a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. For centuries, perhaps millennia, it had circulated quietly among the wild rodents of the steppe, killing a few, sparing others, kept in balance by nature. Then something changed? Historians and scientists still debate exactly what tipped that balance. A shift in climate, a disruption of the ecosystem. Perhaps the great Mongol trade networks, the most efficient the world had ever seen, that now connected these remote grasslands to the bustling ports of the Black Sea. Whatever the cause, the plague broke free of its ancient reservoir, and it began to move west, along the very trade routes that had made the medieval world so rich. It traveled in the fur of rats, and in the guts of fleas. Here is the terrible genius of this disease. The plague bacterium multiplies inside the flea's stomach until it forms a solid blocking mass. The flea, starving, bites its host again and again, desperate to feed, and each time it vomits the bacteria directly into the wound. A single blocked flea is a living syringe of death, biting and biting, unable to stop. The fleas rode the rats rode the ships, and the ships followed the money, straight toward the beating heart of Europe. By 1346, the pestilence had reached a place that would become the site of one of the darkest events in the history of warfare. The siege of Caffa, the city, was called Caffa, a Genoese trading colony on the coast of Crimea, on the site of modern-day Feodosia. In 1346, it was under siege. The attackers were the Golden Horde, the Mongol army of the West, led by a Khan named Jani Beg. For months, the Mongols had surrounded the city, but then, inside their own camp, the soldiers began to die. The plague had caught up with them, sweeping through the tightly packed army, killing thousands. And then, according to a chilling account written by an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongols did something unthinkable. They loaded their own plague-ridden corpses onto their siege catapults, and they hurled the bodies over the walls into the city. They ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city, de Mussi wrote, in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. This is often called the first recorded act of biological warfare in human history. Inside Caffa, the defenders threw the bodies into the sea as fast as they could, but it made no difference. The disease was already among them. And when the surviving Genoese merchants finally fled the doomed city, they climbed aboard their galleys and set sail for home, for Italy. They did not know that they were carrying the end of the world in the holds of their ships. Those were the ships that would arrive in Messina in October of 1347. And now, the chain of curiosity tightens, because a question hangs over everything that follows, a question that no one at the time could answer, and that would drive people to madness, to murder, and to despair. What was this? What was killing them? And why could nothing on earth stop it? From Sicily, the plague did not walk. It flew. The Messinans drove the ships away, so the galleys sailed on to Genoa, and were driven away again, this time with flaming arrows. But everywhere those ships touched, they left the infection behind. Genoa, Venice, Marseille. Within months, the disease had leapt across the entire Mediterranean, establishing beachheads in every major port. And then it began to eat Europe alive. Let us go inside a single city at the height of the horror and see it as the people who lived through it saw it. Let us go to Florence. Our guide is a man named Giovanni Boccaccio. He was there. He watched his own city die around him, and he wrote it down in the introduction to his masterpiece, The Decameron. His account is one of the most vivid, horrifying eyewitness records in all of history. The symptoms, he wrote, began the same way every time. First came the swellings, the gavoccioli, in the groin and the armpit, growing to the size of an apple or an egg. Then the dark blotches spread across the body, the sure sign of impending death. From the first swelling, most people were dead within 3 days. Some died within hours, but it was not just the speed of the dying that broke Florence. It was what the dying did to the living. This tribulation had put such fear into the hearts of men and women. Boccaccio wrote that brother abandoned brother, uncle abandoned nephew, sister left brother, and very often wife abandoned husband. And, even worse, almost unbelievable, fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they had not been theirs. Think about that for a moment. The bonds that hold human society together, a parent's love for a child, snapped under the weight of pure terror. People fled their own dying families because to stay was to die. 2. The dead piled up faster than anyone could bury them. Boccaccio describes it. Bodies dragged out of houses and left in the street. Great pits dug in the churchyards, into which the corpses were thrown by the hundreds, layered like goods in a ship's hold, a layer of bodies, a thin layer of earth. Then more bodies. The people who buried the dead were called the bacchini, often criminals and the desperate poor, the only ones who would take the work. They dragged the bodies through the streets on planks, sometimes several to a board. Boccaccio wrote that there were no mourners, no candles, no ceremony. A man of importance who died was lucky to be followed to his grave by a handful of neighbors, and often not even that. In Florence, a city of perhaps 100,000 people, more than half died in a matter of months. Some estimates run as high as 3/4, and Florence was not unique. This was happening everywhere at once. The 3 faces of death. Here the mystery deepens, because the plague did not kill in only one way. It wore 3 faces. The first, and most common, was the bubonic form. This is the one with the gavoccioli, the black swellings, which are actually the lymph nodes, grotesquely inflamed as the body fights the invading bacteria, spread by the bite of the flea, fatal in perhaps 60% of cases without treatment. Terrible, but slow enough that some survived. The second was far worse, the pneumonic plague. This form settled in the lungs, and it did not need fleas or rats. It spread from person to person through the air in a single cough. To breathe near an infected person was to catch it, and the pneumonic plague killed almost everyone it touched. A mortality rate approaching 100%, often within a day or two. This is why the disease moved so fast, and why quarantine so often failed. You did not need to be bitten, you only needed to be near. And the third face, the rarest and the swiftest, was the septicemic plague, which flooded directly into the bloodstream. It killed so quickly that its victims sometimes went to bed healthy and were found dead. In the morning, their skin blackened by hemorrhaging beneath the surface. Some historians believe it is this blackening, this darkening of the dying flesh, that gave the pestilence the name we know it by today, the Black Death. But now we must confront the question that tormented every soul alive in 1348. They did not know about bacteria. They had never heard of yersinia pestis. They had no idea about fleas or rats or the invisible world of microbes. So when the dying began, when half of everyone they loved began to rot alive, they asked the only question they could: why? In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France did what powerful men do in a crisis. He turned to the experts. He commanded the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the finest scientific minds in Europe, to explain what was happening and why. Their report is a masterpiece of intelligent people being catastrophically wrong. The cause, they concluded, was written in the stars. On the 20th of March, 1345, there had been a conjunction of 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, in the sign of Aquarius. This alignment, they declared, had corrupted the very air. It had drawn up poisonous vapors from the earth and the sea, creating a corruption of the atmosphere. This was the theory of miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad air, by a poisonous mist that hung over infected places. It was completely wrong. But it was also, in a strange and tragic way, almost useful, because it led people to avoid the sick and the stench of the dead, which occasionally helped. Mostly, though, it led to remedies that ranged from the useless to the deadly. People carried posies of flowers to ward off the corrupt air. They rang church bells and fired cannons to break up the bad atmosphere. They fled to the countryside, sometimes carrying the plague with them. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, which weakened patients further. Some doctors lanced the buboes. A few of those patients, remarkably, may have survived. Others swallowed, crushed emeralds or drank potions of gold. The wealthy tried everything. It saved almost none of them. And into this world of desperate, failing medicine stepped one of the most iconic and terrifying figures in all of history. The man in the bird mask, the plague doctor's costume, the waxed coat, the gloves, the staff, and above all that unmistakable beaked mask, is burned into our collective memory. But here's a fact that surprises most people. This famous costume was almost certainly not worn during the Black Death of the 1340s. It was invented later, most likely by a French physician named Charles Delorme in the 17th century, for later waves of plague that continued to strike Europe for centuries. But its logic reaches straight back to the miasma theory of 1348. The long beak was not for show. It was packed with dried flowers, herbs, mint, camphor, and spices. The doctor believed that by breathing through this filter of sweet-smelling substances, he could protect himself from the poisonous, disease-carrying air. He was, of course, wrong about why it worked. But by covering his face and body completely, and keeping his distance with that long wooden staff, the plague doctor did accidentally reduce his exposure to airborne droplets and fleas. Right result. Entirely wrong reason. It is one of the great dark ironies of this story. An age that understood nothing, stumbling occasionally into things that helped, and far more often into things that made everything so much worse. Because when medicine failed, and prayer failed, and flight failed, human beings did what they have always done in the face of the incomprehensible. They went looking for someone to blame. Act 4. The horror we made ourselves. If God was punishing the world, then perhaps the world could be made to repent. And out of this belief rose one of the strangest movements in European history, the flagellants. They appeared in their thousands, marching from town to town, men and sometimes women, who believed that the plague was divine punishment for the sins of humanity. And they intended to take that punishment onto their own bodies. They called their scourges the flails. Twice a day and once at night, they would gather in the town square, form a circle, and begin. They whipped themselves and each other, bloody, driving the iron spikes into their own flesh, chanting hymns, working themselves into an ecstasy of pain and grief. The blood was said to have healing power. Onlookers would rush forward to dip cloths in it. At first, people welcomed them. Here, at last, were men doing something, taking action against the invisible enemy. But the movement grew dangerous. The flagellants began to claim their own spiritual authority, to challenge the church, to whip the sick, and even absolve sins, powers that belonged to priests alone. And in their traveling processions, packed together, moving from town to town, they became something else entirely. They became a perfect vehicle for spreading the very disease they were trying to stop. By 1349, the Pope had condemned them, and authorities across Europe moved to suppress the movement. But the flagellants had already helped unleash something far darker, because their marches were often accompanied by a rising, murderous rage, a search for a scapegoat. And medieval Europe knew exactly where to point the finger. The massacre. Here we arrive at what may be the most shameful chapter of the entire catastrophe, a horror not made by nature, but by human hatred. As the death toll mounted, A monstrous rumor spread across Europe that the Jews were poisoning the wells, that this was not a plague at all, but a deliberate conspiracy to destroy Christendom. It was, of course, a complete lie. The Jews were dying of the plague in exactly the same numbers as everyone else, a fact that should have been obvious. But terror doesn't listen to reason, and centuries of existing prejudice made the accusation catch fire. Under torture, victims confessed to the imaginary plot, and then came the killing. In city after city, in Strasbourg, in Basel, in Mainz, in Cologne, across the German lands and beyond, Jewish communities were rounded up and slaughtered. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, roughly 900 Jews were burned alive in a single day, killed before the plague had even fully arrived in the city as a preemptive act of murderous terror. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of Jewish communities were destroyed entirely during these years. Even the Pope, Clement VI, spoke out against the massacres, issuing declarations that the Jews were innocent, pointing out that they too were dying of the plague. It made little difference. The killing continued. It is one of the darkest truths this story has to teach us, that when human beings are gripped by fear of an invisible enemy, they will too often turn on each other, and the horror we inflict on ourselves can rival the horror inflicted by nature. And still, the plague raged on. It crossed the Alps. It swept through France and into England, reaching London in the autumn of 1348. It sailed to Scandinavia, carried, according to one account, by a single ghost ship of dead sailors that ran aground in Norway, its cargo of wool crawling with infected fleas. It reached Ireland and Iceland and pressed on into Russia, until at last, around 1351, it began to burn itself out, not because anyone had defeated it, but because it had simply run out of people to kill in each place for now. But it was not gone. It would return again and again for the next 300 years. The question that remains is the largest one of all. When the dying finally slowed, when the survivors crept out of their homes and looked around at a world with half its people gone, what kind of world was left? Act 5. The world remade. When the Black Death finally receded, it left behind a continent transformed. And here is the great paradox of this story, the twist that historians still grapple with. Out of the greatest catastrophe in human history came changes that would, in time, reshape civilization itself. Consider the survivors. Before the plague, Europe was overcrowded, land was scarce, labor was cheap, and the peasant, the worker who tilled the soil, was trapped at the bottom of a rigid feudal system, bound to the land with no power and no choice. Then half of them died. Suddenly, labor was the rarest thing in Europe. There were fields to be worked, and not enough hands to work them. And for the first time in centuries, the ordinary worker held something he had never held before: leverage. Peasants and laborers could now demand higher wages, and if one lord refused, they could simply walk to the next estate, where they would be welcomed with open arms. Wages rose. The rigid bonds of serfdom began to crack. The nobility panicked. In England, the government passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, a desperate attempt to freeze wages and force peasants to work for pre-plague pay. It was, in essence, an attempt to hold back an economic tide. It failed, and the resentment it created would help ignite the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a direct aftershock of the plague a generation later. The old certainties were dying along with the old world. The Church, which had promised protection and had delivered none, saw its authority shaken. Priests had died in enormous numbers, often because, to their credit, they had stayed to comfort the dying. Many were replaced by hastily trained, less educated men. And a quiet, corrosive question had entered the minds of millions. If the Church could not save them, then what exactly was its power? This loss of unquestioned faith, this new willingness to doubt. Some historians trace a line from here, from the ashes of the Black Death, all the way to the Renaissance and eventually the Reformation. A world where men began to look at the human being, not just the divine, as the measure of things. Where the individual survivor, having watched the entire medieval order fail, began to think for himself. It is a staggering thought that the modern world, with its rising wages, its questioning of authority, its rebirth of art and human-centered thinking, may owe its shape, in part, to a bacterium carried in the gut of a flea, on the back of a rat, in the hold of a Genoese ship that drifted into Messina harbor one grey October morning, with everyone on board already dead. The thing that never left, the Black Death, killed as many as 1 in every 3 human beings in Europe, and it did not stop there. It reached across the Middle East, North Africa, and deep into Asia. In total, it may have killed 200 million people worldwide, making it, by proportion, the deadliest pandemic in all of recorded human history. It took Europe more than 2 centuries to recover its lost population, and here is the final, unsettling truth. The Black Death never truly ended. Yersinia pestis, the very same bacterium, still exists today. It still lives in wild rodent populations around the world, including in the western United States. Every year, a small number of people still catch the plague. The difference is that today we know what it is. We can see it. And with antibiotics we can usually stop it. But for 4 years in the middle of the 14th century, humanity faced this invisible enemy completely blind, with no science, no cure, and no understanding. They faced the end of their world armed only with prayer, superstition, and their own trembling courage. Some fled, some hid, some turned on their neighbors in fear and hatred, and some, the doctors who stayed, the priests who comforted the dying, the ordinary people who buried the dead, showed a kind of quiet heroism in the face of an apocalypse. The ship that arrived in Messina carried the deadliest cargo in human history. It changed everything: the economy, the church, the balance of power, the very way human beings thought about themselves and their world. It reminds us of something we would do well to remember, even now, 700 years later. That the world can change in a single season, that it can arrive on a quiet morning, drifting out of the fog, and that when it does, what will define us is not the catastrophe itself, but what we choose to do in the face of it.